What if I told you that a single river has determined the fate of 3 continents? The Nile connects 11 countries, shapes political alliances, and continues to fuel international conflicts today. In this documentary, we'll travel from the highlands of Ethiopia to the Mediterranean Sea, exploring the river's hidden influence on history and modern politics. You'll meet farmers whose harvests depend on ancient water rights, engineers building controversial dams, and diplomats negotiating the future of nations. The story of civilization itself cannot be told without understanding how this one geographical feature changed everything, and what its contested waters mean for millions of lives hanging in the balance. The river that flows backwards. Most rivers in the world follow a fairly predictable pattern, flowing from higher elevations to lower ones, typically moving south to north in the northern hemisphere and north to south in the southern hemisphere. The Nile, however, breaks this convention entirely. It flows northward for nearly 4,160 miles from its sources in Central Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean Sea, making it the longest river in Africa and the entire world. This geographical anomaly creates a stark contrast visible even from space. The river appears as a vibrant green ribbon slicing through the golden sands of the Sahara Desert, a vivid illustration of its life-giving properties in an otherwise hostile environment. The northward flow of the Nile results from the region's unique topography. The river begins in the highlands of East Africa, where Lake Victoria contributes to the White Nile, and the Blue Nile begins in the Ethiopian highlands. From these elevated sources, the waters naturally flow toward the lowest point they can reach, the Mediterranean Sea. This direction has profound implications for the people and ecosystems along its banks. For Mohammed Hashim, a 54-year-old farmer in the village of El Mansoura in Egypt's Fertile Delta region, the Nile's unusual flow is more than a geographical curiosity. It's the foundation of his family's existence for 7 generations. Well before dawn each morning, Mohammed walks barefoot through a small field of sugarcane, feeling the cool mud between his toes just as his ancestors did thousands of years ago. His calloused hands deftly adjust the same type of irrigation channels that ancient Egyptians carved through their fields. My grandfather's grandfather taught his son, who taught his son, who taught me, Mohammed explains, gesturing to the carefully maintained network of canals that bring the Nile's waters to his crops. The river gives and we receive. This has never changed. Mohammed's daily routine mirrors practices that would be recognizable to farmers from pharaonic times. He still uses a wooden tool similar to the ancient Egyptian shaduf to lift water from the canal to higher ground. Though modern pumps are available, Mohammed maintains that his traditional methods waste less water and keep him connected to the practices of his forebears. The importance of this connection becomes clear when we examine the environments beyond the river's reach. Less than a mile from Mohammed's lush fields, the land transforms into barren desert where almost nothing grows. The boundary between fertile soil and desert is so abrupt that Egyptians have long referred to their country as the Black Land and the Red Land, the black soil of the floodplain and the red-tinged sands of the desert. This stark division has shaped Egyptian civilization from its earliest days. The narrow strip of arable land along the Nile comprises only about 5% of Egypt's total area, but supports over 95% of its population. In essence, Egypt is the Nile, and the Nile is Egypt. This concentration of human activity along a single waterway has few parallels anywhere else on Earth. The river's north-south orientation connects vastly different ecosystems and climate regions. It brings water from the rainy highlands of East Africa to the arid lowlands of Egypt, essentially transporting rainfall from one climate zone to another. This geographical feature made the river uniquely predictable in ancient times. Before modern dams altered its flow, the Nile would flood annually between June and September, when heavy rains fell in the Ethiopian highlands. These floods deposited rich silt on the floodplains, naturally fertilizing the soil and creating some of the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. Mohammed points to a faded line on a stone wall near his home, a high water mark from before the Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970. My father said the water would come up to here every year, he says. They called it the gift of the Nile. Now the dam controls the water, but we still depend on what comes from the south. The predictability of these annual floods allowed ancient Egyptians to develop sophisticated agricultural techniques and freed portions of the population from food production, enabling the development of specialized trades, complex religious systems, and monumental architecture. It's no coincidence that one of history's earliest and most enduring civilizations arose along this river. The fertile banks of the Nile stand in such stark contrast to the surrounding desert that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. This observation remains as true today as it was 2,500 years ago. Without the river bringing water from the heart of Africa, the magnificent civilization of ancient Egypt could never have developed, and millions of people like Mohammed would not be able to survive in the region today. This geographical exception connects approximately 300 million people across 11 countries, from Tanzania and Burundi in the south to Egypt in the north. The river serves as a crucial source of water for drinking, agriculture, and increasingly hydroelectric power. Despite political boundaries and cultural differences, these millions of people share a common dependence on this single water system. Yet this life-giving resource faces increasing threats. Climate change, population growth, and upstream dam projects are altering the Nile's flow patterns and creating tension between nations that share its waters. Every year, I notice the water in my canals is a little less, Mohammed says, showing how he's had to extend his irrigation channels further toward the main branch of the river. My father never worried about having enough water. Now I worry every season. These observations reflect larger challenges facing the entire Nile Basin. Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, which contributes about 85% of the water that eventually reaches Egypt, has created tensions. While Ethiopia sees the dam as essential for its development, countries downstream fear reduced water supply. Despite these challenges, the Nile continues to sustain life along its banks, just as it has for millennia. As the sun rises over Mohammed's fields, the first rays illuminate a patchwork of green crops stretching toward the horizon, bordered by the sharp edge of the desert, a visible boundary between fertility and barrenness that encapsulates the critical role this northward flowing river has played in human history. The Highland Springs. 2,000 miles upstream from Mohammed's Egyptian farm, Abebe Tedesse wakes before dawn in the misty highlands of Ethiopia. As morning light spills over the rolling green landscape, he performs a water blessing that his ancestors have practiced for generations. Cupping the cool, clear water in his hands, he pours a small libation into the stream that will begin an extraordinary journey, flowing through gorges and valleys across international borders, and eventually reaching the parched fields of Egypt's delta. This water is Ethiopia's gift to the world, Abebe often says, watching the stream that begins near his farm eventually join the mighty Blue Nile. The connection is remarkable for how profoundly it links the fates of people who may never meet. The Ethiopian highlands stand as the lifeblood of the Nile Basin. Verdant valleys where morning mist clings to ancient trees, the scent of damp earth rising as sunlight filters through clouds. From these heights springs the Blue Nile, contributing approximately 85% of the entire Nile's water flow, making the farmers who tend these highlands the unwitting stewards of Egypt's prosperity. Abebe's 5-acre farm sits near one of the countless tributaries feeding Lake Tana, the official source of the Blue Nile. His family has farmed this land for 6 generations, their fortunes rising and falling with the seasonal rains. From his hillside fields, he can sometimes glimpse the lake on clear days, shimmering like a mirror beneath the vast Ethiopian sky. My grandfather taught me that our waters are sacred, Abebe explains as he walks along terraced fields of teff, Ethiopia's ancient grain. He said what happens here matters all the way to the Great Sea. That Great Sea is the Mediterranean, where the Nile's waters finally complete their 4,000-mile journey after passing through the fields of farmers like Mohammed in Egypt. Unlike Mohammed's farm, which depends entirely on river irrigation, Abebe's crops rely primarily on rainfall. but the connection to the Nile remains central to his identity. Throughout Ethiopia's highlands, the Blue Nile serves as an artery of life, pulsing with cultural significance, carrying the lifeblood of tradition while sustaining communities physically and spiritually. This sense of ownership manifests in communal ceremonies that mark the river's rhythms. During Timkat, the Ethiopian Orthodox celebration of Epiphany each January, priests lead processions to local waterways for blessings that symbolize Christ's baptism. As water droplets catch the morning light during these ceremonies, they reflect both heaven and earth, a daily reminder that the spiritual and practical value of water cannot be separated in highland life. Water is life here, just as it is for those downstream, says Abebe, who serves as a volunteer in local watershed management efforts. These community-based conservation initiatives have grown increasingly important as pressures on the Blue Nile intensify. Working alongside neighbors, Abebe plants native trees along stream banks to prevent erosion, constructs small check dams to slow water flow during heavy rains, and monitors water quality. These conservation efforts represent a grassroots recognition of the river's importance for all 11 nations that share the Nile's waters. Yet this shared resource has become increasingly contested as countries assert their rights to development and water security. For Abebe, Ethiopia's right to harness the river's potential seems self-evident. "We have lived with hunger while watching our water flow away," he says, referencing Ethiopia's historical struggles with drought and famine despite being the source of so much water wealth. "Now we want to use our river to bring light to our homes and growth to our economy." This aspiration is reflected in Abebe's own modest dreams. Like 60% of his fellow Ethiopians, his home lacks electricity. He relies on kerosene lamps for evening light and walks 5 miles to the nearest town with reliable cell phone charging services. The promise of hydroelectric power from the Nile represents the possibility of transformation, refrigeration for medicines and food, light for children to study by, and new opportunities for small businesses. His hopes mirror Ethiopia's national ambitions for development, embodied most dramatically in the massive dam project that has become both a source of pride and international tension. For Abebe and many Ethiopians, the dam represents infrastructure and justice, a reclaiming of resources that have historically benefited downstream nations while leaving Ethiopia in poverty. Yet Abebe's perspective is more nuanced than simple national pride. Through agricultural extension programs, he has learned about the complex ecosystem of the Nile Basin and occasionally exchanges information with farming cooperatives in Sudan. This has given him an appreciation for the interconnected nature of the river system and the legitimate concerns of those downstream. The water should serve everyone, he reflects. But first it must serve those who have gone without for too long. The paradox of the Nile is evident in this tension between cooperation and competition. The same water that nurtures Abebe's crops will eventually sustain Mohammed's fields in Egypt, creating an inescapable connection despite vast differences in culture, religion, and national identity. Climate change has added urgency to this relationship. Abebe has noticed changing rainfall patterns, with more intense downpours followed by longer dry periods. These shifts affect not only his own farming, but potentially the flow patterns of the entire Nile system. As the morning mist burns away, Abebe carefully opens irrigation channels to direct water to his youngest teff plants. His movements echo those of Mohammed in Egypt, though their irrigation techniques differ. Where Mohammed uses gravity-fed canals derived from ancient Egyptian methods, Abebe employs terracing and small-scale water harvesting to maximize efficiency on his hillside farm. Looking toward the distant horizon where his water eventually flows, Abebe sometimes wonders about the farmers and fishermen who will benefit from it. "We never meet, but we drink from the same cup," he says, expressing an insight that transcends political disputes over the river. A dam of dreams and disputes. These grassroots connections between farmers highlight a profound irony. While individuals find common cause across borders, their governments are locked in one of the most contentious water disputes of the 21st century. How can a single dam project simultaneously represent economic salvation for 60% of Ethiopia's population while being perceived as an existential threat by Egypt, a nation whose fate has been tied to the same river for millennia? Salam Bekele adjusts her hard hat as she steps onto the observation platform overlooking the massive concrete structure spanning the Blue Nile Gorge. As a senior structural engineer at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, her daily inspections have become a ritual filled with both professional scrutiny and personal meaning. Each morning when I arrive, I still feel that sense of awe, she says, gesturing toward the mile-long dam rising 145 meters from the riverbed. This structure represents the physical embodiment of what Ethiopia can achieve. For Salam, the $4.2 billion project embodies her country's aspirations. She keeps a photograph in her office of her grandmother's village, where kerosene lamps still provide the only evening light. My grandmother never saw an electric light bulb until she visited me in Addis Ababa when I was in university, Salam explains. This dam is about transforming lives like hers. From her vantage point, construction vehicles appear like toys against the dam's immense walls. What was once a narrow gorge has been transformed into a megastructure designed to harness the power of Africa's second-largest river. When fully filled, the dam's reservoir will create a surface area comparable to Greater London. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, when fully operational, is expected to double Ethiopia's electricity output. For a country where 60% of people live without access to power, this represents a profound change. Schools without lights, health clinics that can't refrigerate vaccines, and businesses forced to close at sunset could all be transformed by the dam's 6,450 megawatts of generating capacity. What makes the project even more remarkable is how it came to be. When international financiers hesitated to fund the ambitious project, ordinary Ethiopians stepped forward. Government employees donated 1 month's salary. Farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers purchased government bonds with whatever they could spare. Even Ethiopian diaspora communities organized fundraising events. This is truly the people's dam, Salam notes, pointing to a wall in the project office covered with photographs of ordinary citizens who contributed. When people ask who's funding this project, the answer is simple. Ethiopians built this dam with their own resources because they believe in its promise. The dam's significance extends beyond Ethiopia's borders. It's designed to supply electricity domestically and to neighboring Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, and Eritrea, potentially creating an integrated regional power grid that could accelerate development across East Africa. Yet the same waters that represent hope for Ethiopia have generated fear and tension downstream. As Salam walks along the dam's crest, she acknowledges the complexity of harnessing a transboundary river. We understand that Egypt depends on the Nile. That's never been in question, she says. But this dam doesn't consume water. It uses the flow to generate power before releasing it downstream. The technical distinction between consumptive and non-consumptive water use forms the core of Ethiopia's position. Unlike irrigation projects that permanently remove water from the river system, hydroelectric dams ultimately release the water they temporarily hold. Ethiopia frames the GERD as a non-consumptive hydropower project that will benefit countries beyond its borders by providing affordable electric power while helping regulate water flow during droughts and floods. Egyptian concerns center on the dam's filling timeline and its operation during drought periods. The reservoir's massive 74 billion cubic meter capacity has prompted worries about potential reductions in downstream flow, especially during the critical filling phase. For a country that relies on the Nile for nearly all its water needs, even temporary reductions raise existential questions. International tensions over the dam have escalated to diplomatic intervention. The United States previously threatened to withhold development aid to Ethiopia if an agreement wasn't reached, even withholding $130 million to pressure Ethiopia into signing a U.S. proposed agreement. When former President Trump suggested that Egyptians might blow up the dam, many Ethiopians viewed it as evidence of American bias toward Egypt, though subsequent administrations have distanced themselves from this approach. Selam points to a map in her office showing the 11 countries sharing the Nile Basin. This river connects us all, whether we recognize it or not, she observes. The solution isn't for Ethiopia to abandon its development goals, but for all of us to find sustainable ways to share these waters. As she completes her inspection, Selam notes environmental monitoring stations tracking water quality, sediment levels, and ecological impacts. We're building this dam to last generations, which means we must ensure it operates sustainably, she explains. The personal significance of the project became clear when Selam's team completed a major concrete pour during the rainy season. After the successful operation, she called her father, a science teacher in rural Ethiopia for 40 years. He told me that for the first time, he felt true hope that his grandchildren would grow up in an Ethiopia not defined by poverty, but by possibility, she recalls, her voice softening. That's when I truly understood what we're building here. As sunset approaches, the dam's massive structure casts long shadows across the gorge. Construction lights flicker on, allowing work to continue through the night. Before leaving, Selam pauses for a final look at the structure silhouetted against the darkening sky. People sometimes ask if I feel the weight of responsibility working on such a controversial project, she says. I tell them I feel the weight of opportunity, the chance to demonstrate that Ethiopia can manage this resource responsibly while lifting millions from poverty. That's the legacy we're trying to build. The fisherman's fears. As the same waters that promise electricity and development upstream tell a different story where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, the consequences of changing river patterns become starkly visible. Each morning before dawn, Hassan El-Sayed casts his nets into waters increasingly unfamiliar to him. A fisherman whose intimate knowledge of the delta can explain why the fish his father once caught in abundance have largely disappeared. At 4:30 a.m., Hassan's weathered hands prep his small wooden boat by the fading light of a battery-powered lamp. The salt-tinged air fills his lungs as the gentle lapping of brackish water against the hull creates a rhythm he's known since childhood. The rituals are the same ones his grandfather taught his father decades ago, but the results grow more disappointing with each passing season. His boat glides silently through the outer delta, a space where fresh and salt water have historically maintained a delicate balance. When I was a boy helping my father, Hassan explains as he casts his first net of the day, the worn rope slipping through his calloused fingers, this single throw would catch enough fish to feed 3 families. Now I might work until noon to catch barely enough for one. The steady decline in fish populations represents the gradual erosion of a way of life that has sustained his family for generations. The waters of the delta have always been subject to natural fluctuations, but Hassan notes that recent changes feel fundamentally different. The seasonal rhythms that fishermen have relied upon for centuries have become increasingly unpredictable. Fish species that were once abundant now appear sporadically or not at all, forcing Hassan and his peers to target different species and venture into unfamiliar fishing grounds. This transformation isn't happening in isolation. The delta, once one of the most productive ecosystems in the Mediterranean region, is experiencing a decline in its overall health. The construction of dams upstream has interrupted the natural flow of nutrients that historically replenished the delta's waters and supported its diverse marine life. Without this consistent influx of nutrients, the food chain that Hassan's livelihood depends on has begun to collapse. But dams are only part of a more complex story. Climate change has introduced additional stressors to an already fragile ecosystem. Rising sea levels push saltwater farther into the delta, altering the delicate balance that many freshwater species require. For Hassan, these scientific explanations translate into empty nets and an uncertain future. My grandfather taught my father to read the water by its color, Hassan says as he examines today's meager catch, the few fish glistening weakly in the morning sun. Clear water meant good fishing in certain spots, cloudy water in others. Now the water speaks a language none of us understand. This loss of predictability represents more than just a practical challenge. It signifies the breakdown of knowledge systems that have been passed down through generations. As the morning progresses, Hassan navigates to 3 more fishing spots. His small boat cuts through mist-covered waters, then drifts silently as he throws and pulls his nets with practiced motions. By mid-morning, his catch consists of a handful of tilapia, 2 catfish, and several smaller fish that his father would have considered barely worth keeping. The changing conditions have forced adaptation of fishing techniques. Traditional nets designed for larger fish have been modified to catch smaller species that were once ignored. Fishing schedules have shifted to accommodate changing fish movement patterns. Some fishermen have begun using more aggressive methods that, while temporarily effective, risk further damaging the ecosystem. My oldest son has modified our nets 3 times in the past 5 years, Hassan explains. Each time, we target different fish, smaller fish, fish that swim deeper or in different patterns. These adaptations demonstrate the resilience of delta communities, but they also reveal the precariousness of their situation. The challenges extend beyond the water's edge. Saltwater intrusion from the Mediterranean Sea has begun to contaminate previously fertile farmland along the delta's periphery. Fields that once produced abundant crops now yield plants stunted by salt exposure, their leaves yellowed and brittle where they should be green and supple. This contamination has particularly devastating consequences for farmers. Crop yields diminish gradually at first, then dramatically as soil salinity reaches critical levels. Fields that have been productive for generations can become essentially unusable. Within a decade, the agricultural base that has sustained the Delta region for millennia faces an existential threat that compounds the challenges facing fishing communities. Hassan's family has begun to diversify their income sources out of necessity. His wife runs a small food stand in the nearby village. His eldest son splits his time between fishing and working as a day laborer in construction. His daughter has moved to Alexandria to work in the tourism industry, sending money home when possible. My father was only a fisherman, and his father before him, Hassan reflects. Now none of us can be only one thing. We must be many things to survive. This diversification strategy reveals both the adaptability of delta communities and the profound disruption of traditional livelihood patterns. The challenges Hassan faces reflect broader patterns affecting the entire Nile Delta ecosystem. Population growth has increased demand for the river's resources, creating greater competition for diminishing supplies. These compounding factors create a complex web of challenges that defy simple solutions. Hassan understands these complexities. We cannot ask people not to build for their future, he says, but neither can we allow the past to disappear completely. This perspective reflects a nuanced understanding of the competing needs along the river. It acknowledges the legitimacy of development goals while insisting on the value of traditional livelihoods and ecosystems. As Hassan returns to shore around midday, the physical toll of his work is visible in his labored movements. The sun reflects harshly off water that holds fewer secrets for him with each passing year. The psychological weight he carries is equally significant. The knowledge that his sons may be the last generation of fishermen in a family lineage that stretches back as far as their collective memory. For communities along the Nile Delta, adaptation has become a constant necessity. These adaptations demonstrate remarkable resilience, water wars but occur within constraints. Behind the struggles of fishermen like Hassan lies a high-stakes diplomatic chess game where ancient treaties collide with modern ambitions. The colonial-era agreements that once carved up the Nile's waters still haunt today's negotiations, with Ethiopia providing the majority of the river's flow, while historical documents grant Egypt veto power over upstream projects. In a sparse conference room overlooking Khartoum, Dr. Amina Osman reviews briefing papers before another round of trilateral talks. As Sudan's lead water negotiator, she occupies perhaps the most precarious diplomatic position in Africa. A hydrologist by training with 20 years of experience in transboundary water management, Dr. Amina now finds herself mediating between two nations whose water disputes predate her country's independence. We are negotiating the future of three nations whose histories, economies, and national identities are tied to the same river, Dr. Amina explains between meetings. Sudan's position is uniquely complex. The country stands to benefit from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam through regulated flow that could prevent devastating floods and provide cheaper electricity. Yet it also shares Egypt's downstream vulnerability during drought years or if water release protocols aren't properly established. Colonial agreements cast long shadows over current talks. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty granted Egypt veto power over upstream projects, later reinforced by the 1959 agreement that allocated Nile waters solely to Egypt and Sudan, completely excluding Ethiopia and other upstream nations. These treaties were created in a different era, Dr. Amina notes. Ethiopia wasn't even at the table when its water rights were decided. Neither were Uganda, Kenya, or Tanzania. Imagine having no say over resources that begin in your territory. Ethiopia rejects these agreements as colonial relics, highlighting the injustice of supplying most water while having no formal rights to it. Egypt considers these treaties the foundation of its water security and national survival. Once, during a midnight negotiation session, I watched an Ethiopian diplomat place a small vial of Blue Nile water on the table. Dr. Amina recalls. He said, "This begins in our highlands, yet we're told we cannot use it." The Egyptian representative responded by placing a handful of soil beside it, saying, "Without this water, our land becomes this dust." Sometimes we spend entire days negotiating paragraph by paragraph, Dr. Amina shares. Behind each term is a nation's fears and aspirations. The diplomatic landscape reveals complex dynamics. Egypt seeks international involvement through the UN and Western mediation. Ethiopia prefers an African Union framework, emphasizing African solutions to African problems. Sudan's position has shifted with its changing political landscape. Dr. Amina's connection to the negotiations runs deep. Born near the confluence of the Blue and White Nile, she witnessed how decisions made in distant capitals affected local fishermen and farmers. "I carry their stories into every meeting," she says, showing a worn photograph of her childhood village. When negotiations stall on technical points, I describe how last year's floods washed away entire communities, or how drought forced families to abandon farms cultivated for generations. Technical disputes center on Ethiopia's reservoir filling timeline and drought operations. A University of Southern California study found that Ethiopia's preferred short-term filling strategy could nearly double water deficits in Egypt, translating directly to failed crops and lost livelihoods. "Water cannot be created out of nothing," she explains. Each percentage point in these models represents thousands of families whose futures hang in balance. The conflict transcends resources. For Egypt, the Nile defines national identity. For Ethiopia, the GERD symbolizes unity and development potential. Dr. Amina navigates these powerful narratives alongside technical data. During one difficult session, she remembers, I asked each delegation to describe what the Nile meant to their people. The responses showed that beyond cubic meters and megawatts, we're negotiating national dignity and historical narratives. Climate change adds urgency to these talks. Models predict more variable rainfall across the Nile basin, intense floods alternating with prolonged droughts. Dr. Amina incorporates these projections into negotiations. Last summer, she says, I brought all 3 delegations to a dried riverbed that once supported thousands of farmers. Standing there in the cracked mud, technical arguments fell away. Everyone understood what failure would mean. Despite challenges, progress happens incrementally. The countries have established some technical parameters, including drought thresholds and data sharing mechanisms. We build consensus brick by brick, she says. Sometimes, agreements on monitoring stations or flow data help build trust for the more difficult questions. The diplomatic landscape extends beyond Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. All 11 Nile Basin countries have interests at stake, while international powers from China to the United States influence regional dynamics. In her quieter moments, Dr. Amina reflects on the river's unifying potential. I have a small ritual before major negotiation rounds, she confides. I visit the point where the Blue and White Nile meet, different waters joining to become something greater. I remind myself that cooperation isn't just possible, it's natural. As negotiations continue, Dr. Amina carries the weight of millions whose lives depend on diplomatic success. At the end of each day, regardless of what flags sit on the negotiation table, we are all dependent on the same river, she says. This is what I remind my counterparts when talks stall. Sacred waters. The same waters that nations fight to control are also the ones they worship together, often using rituals that mirror each other in surprising ways. Beyond diplomatic conferences and policy debates, the Nile has forged a connection between diverse peoples that runs deeper than politics, a spiritual bond that has endured for millennia. Father Tedesse stands knee-deep in the clear waters of Lake Tana, source of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. Wearing elaborate vestments of white and gold, he carefully guides a young woman backward into the sacred waters. This lake is where heaven touches earth, he explains after completing the baptism. When we immerse in these waters, we connect with a tradition stretching back to the baptism of Christ in the Jordan River. Around him, dozens of white-robed Ethiopians await their turn, singing hymns that have echoed across these highlands for centuries. Nearby, an Orthodox priest tends to a small shrine built near the water's edge. The structure incorporates distinctive circular patterns reminiscent of ancient Lalibela churches, hewn from solid rock in the 12th century. Inside, worshippers venerate manuscripts depicting the Archangel Michael, guardian of these sacred waters, before they begin their journey northward. 800 miles downstream in South Sudan, spiritual leader Akal Deng performs a ceremony at dawn. By the misty riverside, he pours honey wine into the flowing current while reciting prayers in Dinka. Our ancestors have always understood that the river is alive, he says. We honor the spirit flowing through it, connecting us to those who came before and those who will come after. During seasonal ceremonies, young men covered in white ash perform ritual dances at the water's edge, their movements mimicking the river's flow while ensuring fertility for cattle and fields. Women create intricate clay patterns collected from the riverbank, designs that tell the story of their people's relationship with the Nile. In Cairo, Imam Hassan leads evening prayers at the Al-Azhar Mosque, where 1,000-year-old ablution fountains allow worshippers to perform wudu, the ritual cleansing. In Islam, water is the primary means of purification, he explains. The Quran tells us that Allah created every living thing from water. Here in Egypt, this truth is impossible to ignore. Without the Nile, there would be no life. The mosque's architecture mirrors the river's flow, with courtyards channeling rainwater and decorative motifs echoing the Nile's rippling patterns. During Ramadan, special prayers thank Allah for the blessing of water in the desert, particularly meaningful where fertile soil meets barren sand. Across these diverse traditions, water, particularly the Nile, serves as a conduit between physical and spiritual realms. Each incorporates ritual cleansing as a path to spiritual purity, acknowledging humanity's profound dependence on this life-giving force. This spiritual connection predates current religious traditions. Ancient Egyptians revered the river as divine, with the annual flooding celebrated as the work of Hapi, god of fertility. With blue-green skin symbolizing water and vegetation, Hapi embodied the cycle of abundance and renewal that continues to influence regional spirituality today. Water was central to ancient Egyptian beliefs, explains Dr. Fatima El-Rashidi from the Cairo Museum. The Nile marked the boundary between the living on the east bank and the dead on the west. The sun god Ra's daily journey, across the sky by day and through the watery underworld at night, mirrored the Nile's annual rhythm of flood and recession. These concepts permeate contemporary practices. Ethiopian Tikat celebrations feature the blessing of water commemorating Christ's baptism, with participants sprinkled with water from Lake Tana in a ritual that transforms ancient purification ceremonies into Christian context. Sister Ababek, tending a monastery garden near the Blue Nile source, grows medicinal plants using water from a sacred spring. This water has healing properties, she explains. People travel hundreds of kilometers to collect it, regardless of faith. Water recognizes no religious boundaries. It heals Muslims, Christians, and those of traditional beliefs equally. The Nile's significance extends beyond religion into cultural expressions. Sudanese poet Majid Sharif personifies the river as history's witness. You have seen pharaohs and prophets, warriors and saints, all come to kneel at your banks and draw life from your depths. At cultural celebrations, dancers embody the river's flow with undulating movements, their bodies becoming the current itself. This shared reverence creates bridges between divided communities. Rabbi David Cohen from Alexandria's Jewish community observes, the ancient Hebrews escaped slavery by crossing water. Moses was drawn from the Nile's reeds. Water is boundary and gateway, danger and salvation. Paradoxes understood by all who live along this river. Water-centered interfaith dialogues have emerged as successful forms of cross-cultural exchange. The annual Rivers of Faith Conference brings together religious leaders from all Nile Basin countries, producing joint declarations on water protection signed by multiple faith traditions. Our spiritual connection to the river provides common ground that politics cannot, explains Father Gabriel, an Ethiopian Orthodox priest who organizes the conference. When an imam speaks of water as Allah's mercy made visible, and I speak of it as God's bounty flowing from Eden, we recognize we are describing the same profound truth. These spiritual connections yield practical benefits. Religious institutions have become partners in conservation efforts, with sacred sites serving as environmental education centers. In Uganda, interfaith river cleanup programs unite diverse faith communities, while religious leaders frame environmental protection as spiritual obligation. Near Jinja, where the Nile flows from Lake Victoria, Imam Abdul incorporates water stewardship into prayers. The Prophet Muhammad taught that wasting water is forbidden even by a flowing river. Here, by this great river, we have a special responsibility to honor this teaching. The women of the Watershed. As dawn breaks over a Sudanese village, Fatima Abkar rises before her family, preparing for a journey her mother, grandmother, and countless generations before her have made. But unlike her ancestors, she's transforming how entire communities manage water. At 37, Fatima leads the Blue Nile Women's Water Cooperative, a group that has become a powerful force in watershed management across 3 provinces in Sudan. The women who walk farthest for water understand best how to protect it, Fatima explains as she adjusts her colorful tobe, the traditional Sudanese wrap, its fabric catching the early morning light. Today, she'll be training 20 women from neighboring villages in rainwater harvesting techniques that can reduce their daily water collection journeys. The burden of water collection has traditionally fallen on women and girls throughout the Nile Basin. In many rural communities, they walk up to 8 kilometers each day, carrying heavy jerry cans or clay pots balanced expertly on their heads. Women are now leveraging their intimate knowledge of local water systems to lead conservation initiatives. Fatima's cooperative began with just 7 members in 2015. Today, it includes over 200 women from 23 villages who manage community water tanks, implement conservation techniques, and advocate for women's participation in water governance. At the training center, a simple structure with mud brick walls and a corrugated metal roof, Fatima's hands move with practiced precision. Women gather close, watching intently as she arranges stones in a pattern that will channel rainwater. Her fingers trace the path water will follow, a path to transformation. Before we built these systems, the rains would come and go quickly, washing away topsoil and leaving little moisture behind, says Amina, one of the trainees. Now we capture this water and extend its use through the dry season. The techniques being taught combine traditional knowledge with modern adaptations. Women have always understood local water cycles, identifying which springs remain reliable during droughts and which soil types retain moisture longest. This knowledge, passed down through generations, is now being systematically documented and enhanced with scientific measurements. In neighboring Ethiopia, similar women-led initiatives are taking root. 32-year-old Hawa Negash coordinates a network of 10 water cooperatives in villages surrounding Lake Tana. Her organization has pioneered community water monitoring using simple testing kits to track pollution levels. Women see the changes in water quality first, Hawa explains. When the water makes our children sick or kills our gardens, we are the first to notice. Now we have tools to measure these changes and address their causes. Climate change has made these women's traditional knowledge increasingly valuable. As rainfall patterns become more erratic across the Nile Basin, the ability to predict and adapt to changes in water availability can mean the difference between subsistence and hunger. Fatima cups her hands, mimicking how she once gathered water drop by drop from a nearly dry streambed. My grandmother taught me to watch certain birds that would appear before the rains. Now these patterns are changing. The birds come, but sometimes the rains don't follow. We must combine what our ancestors knew with new information. This combination of traditional wisdom and innovation yields remarkable results. In villages where Fatima's cooperative has implemented water management techniques, women now spend 70% less time collecting water. Water becomes not just sustenance, but liberation, freeing hours for education, small businesses, and community governance. Waterborne diseases have decreased significantly in communities with improved water management. Children, especially girls, are attending school more regularly, no longer needed for water collection duties. As Fatima leads us to a community water point, a covered well with a hand pump installed by her cooperative, we meet Samia, a 12-year-old girl filling her family's water container. Before the pump was installed, Samia missed school 3 days each week. Now she attends regularly and dreams of becoming a doctor. These successes haven't come without challenges. Fatima recounts the skepticism she encountered when first proposing that women should serve on the Regional Water Council. The men laughed, she recalls, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting determination. They said women should carry water, not manage it. But when our first project succeeded, when we showed how much water could be saved and how many crops could be grown with proper management, their attitudes began to change. Now, Fatima sits on the Regional Water Governance Council, one of 3 women among 12 members. Her cooperative success has shifted perceptions about women's capabilities and roles. Men who once dismissed the women's initiatives now consult them on irrigation planning and water conservation. The innovations emerging from these women-led groups transcend gender barriers, political and religious divisions. In northern Uganda, Muslim and Christian women's groups have established a knowledge-sharing network that meets monthly to exchange water conservation techniques. A solar-powered drip irrigation system designed by a women's cooperative in Egypt and adapted by Fatima's group for use in Sudan has reduced water usage by up to 60% while increasing crop yields. Water quality monitoring has become a focus for many women's groups. Using smartphone apps developed for communities with limited literacy, women track changes in water clarity, smell, and contaminants. This information creates an early warning system for pollution or drought conditions. When one village notices a change in water quality, they alert those downstream, explains Fatima, drawing a flowing line in the sand. This communication network has prevented several health crises. The impact extends beyond practical water management. Young girls growing up in these communities now see women in positions of authority, managing resources crucial to community survival. My daughter doesn't know a world where women only carry water, says Nawal, a member of Fatima's cooperative. She knows a world where women decide how water will be used, conserved, and protected. As climate change intensifies across the Nile Basin, these women's groups have become essential guardians of water security. Their approach combines immediate practical solutions with long-term conservation strategies, addressing both current needs and future sustainability. Innovation along the banks. The conservation strategies pioneered by women's groups are just the beginning of innovation along the Nile. In fields that have been cultivated continuously since pharaonic times, a quiet technological revolution is taking root. Traditional farmers who once viewed modern methods with suspicion are now becoming their most passionate advocates, but only after technology adapted to honor ancient wisdom rather than replace it. Youssef Ibrahim walks between rows of tomatoes on a small farm outside Cairo, adjusting thin black tubes that deliver water directly to the base of each plant. At 29, This agricultural engineer represents a new generation of Egyptian innovators developing solutions at the intersection of tradition and technology. My grandfather would never believe we could grow more food with half the water, Youssef says as he checks soil moisture sensors connected to his smartphone. But the irony is that we're actually returning to principles farmers here have always known, that every drop of water is precious. Where his ancestors once diverted precious Nile water through earthen channels that lost much to evaporation, Youssef's system combines solar-powered pumps with precision drip irrigation. This hybrid approach delivers water with remarkable efficiency, extracting every drop of promise from the river's flow. When I first arrived with all this equipment, the older farmers laughed, he recalls. They said their ancestors had been farming this land for thousands of years without such things. But then I asked them to show me how they determined when plants needed water. That question began a collaboration rather than a replacement of knowledge. Youssef discovered that traditional farmers had developed sophisticated methods for assessing soil moisture by feel and appearance, knowledge he incorporated into calibrating his automated systems. The results speak for themselves. Farms implementing these hybrid irrigation systems have reduced water consumption by up to 50% while simultaneously increasing crop yields. This paradox, using less to produce more, may hold the key to the river's future. In nearby fields, the contrast is stark. Side-by-side plots demonstrate the difference. Conventional flood irrigation consumes vast quantities of water, much lost to evaporation under the hot Egyptian sun. On Youssef's demonstration plot, precisely controlled drip lines deliver water directly to root zones, eliminating waste while maximizing growth. What makes this approach particularly valuable in the Nile Basin is its accessibility. The systems are modular, allowing farmers to start small and expand gradually. Initial costs are offset by water savings and improved yields, typically paying for themselves within 2 growing seasons. The challenge was never the technology, Youssef explains. It was finding the right balance between innovation and tradition, creating systems farmers could maintain themselves and adapt to their specific conditions. This respect for local knowledge has been key to adoption. Rather than imposing solutions, engineers across the basin are creating collaborative partnerships with farming communities, resulting in technologies that blend seamlessly with established practices. Ahmed Mahmoud, a farmer who initially resisted the new methods, now hosts training sessions on his land. I thought this young man with his tubes and solar panels was crazy, Ahmed admits with a smile. But when I saw my neighbor's yields increase while using half the water, I changed my mind. Ahmed's transformation from skeptic to advocate illustrates a pattern repeating throughout the Nile Basin. Initial resistance gives way to cautious trials, followed by enthusiastic adoption as farmers witness the benefits firsthand. These initiatives are spreading across national boundaries, despite political tensions surrounding Nile water rights. In Sudan, farmers adapt Egyptian innovations to their conditions. Ethiopian agricultural cooperatives implement similar systems, often improving upon the original designs. This cross-border collaboration creates an interesting counterpoint to disputes over water allocation. While governments negotiate water treaties, farmers develop methods that make those negotiations less critical by reducing the water needed for agriculture, which consumes over 80% of the Nile's water. The innovations extend beyond irrigation. In Uganda, farmers utilize smartphone applications to monitor water quality in real time, creating an early warning system for potential contamination. These apps, developed by local engineers, allow communities to protect their water resources proactively. In Sudan, a network of solar-powered weather stations provides microclimate data to farmers, helping them optimize planting schedules. These stations, constructed largely from locally sourced materials, represent another example of technology that empowers rather than replaces local knowledge. What makes these innovations particularly powerful is their cultural compatibility. They enhance existing practices rather than requiring farmers to abandon traditional methods. This approach recognizes that agricultural traditions along the Nile have evolved over millennia, because they work within the river's unique ecological context. The most sustainable solutions don't arrive from outside, Youssef observes. They grow from within communities, building on knowledge passed down through generations. This philosophy guides his work with farming cooperatives across Egypt. Rather than prescribing uniform solutions, he tailors systems to each community's specific needs and capabilities. The integration of solar power has been particularly transformative. In regions with unreliable electricity but abundant sunshine, solar-powered irrigation provides independence from unreliable grids and expensive diesel fuel. Working with agricultural researchers, farmers are rediscovering native crop varieties that require less water while providing better nutrition. These heritage crops, combined with precision irrigation, create farming systems uniquely adapted to local conditions. What's particularly encouraging is how these innovations spread organically between communities. When farmers see neighbors succeeding with new methods, adoption rates accelerate. Information sharing happens through formal training programs, but also through traditional social networks that span national boundaries. These innovations are creating economic opportunities that help preserve traditional livelihoods. Young people who might otherwise abandon farming for urban jobs are finding new possibilities in agricultural technology. Amal Hassan, a young farmer who returned to her family's land after studying engineering, represents this new generation. My father thought I was crazy to come back to farming, she says. But with these new methods, we're earning more while working less. From local waters I can continue to global our family tradition from the rural while using my education to bustling European markets. The Nile's flow extends far beyond its physical boundaries. While Amal Hassan found a way to honor tradition through technology, thousands of other Nile farmers are experiencing a different transformation, sending their harvest to dinner tables 5,000 miles away. What happens when a small-scale farmer's livelihood depends on both the ancient rhythm of the river and the modern pulse of global commerce? In the verdant region of northern Uganda, 34-year-old Aisha Nakato inspects rows of vibrant bell peppers on her 3-acre farm. The morning sun gleams off irrigation channels that direct precious Nile water to her export-quality crops. 10 years ago, this same plot grew only enough maize and cassava to feed her family, with perhaps a small surplus for the local market. Today, her produce travels further than she ever has. My grandmother would not recognize farming as I practice it, Aisha says, adjusting the soil moisture sensor that helps her optimize water usage. She taught me to watch the clouds for rain. Now I watch export prices and shipping schedules too. Aisha represents a growing cohort of small-scale farmers along the Nile who have transitioned from subsistence agriculture to export-oriented production. This shift has fundamentally changed their relationship with the river. Water serves as both a life-giving resource and a production input connecting them to global supply chains, much like how individual raindrops join to form the mighty Nile itself. The transformation began when an agricultural cooperative approached Aisha about growing high-value crops for European markets. The proposition was compelling, better income, but with new challenges. Export markets demanded consistent quality, specific varieties, and strict adherence to food safety standards. Most critically, they required reliable irrigation that only the Nile could provide. The first season was difficult, Aisha recalls. I had to learn about pesticide restrictions in Europe, packaging requirements, cooling chains, all while making sure my irrigation system delivered exactly the right amount of water at the right time. Her farm now produces 3 varieties of peppers, green beans, and specialty herbs destined for European supermarkets. Each harvest begins a journey from her Nile-irrigated fields to processing facilities in Kampala, then by air to Europe. This global connection creates a profound emotional shift. Aisha now worries equally about local weather patterns and market conditions thousands of miles away. The connection between Nile water and global markets extends beyond fresh produce. The fertile soil enriched by the river's historic floods has long enabled large-scale production of agricultural products. Egypt, drawing on the Nile's reliable flow, has been exporting to Mediterranean markets since ancient times. The Suez Canal symbolizes this global connection, linking the Nile Delta directly to international shipping routes. This 120-mile waterway connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, dramatically shortening the journey between Europe and Asia. For Nile farmers, the canal represents the vital final link connecting their livelihoods to world markets. In 2019 alone, nearly 19,000 vessels carried over 1 billion tons of cargo through the canal, up from 17,800 ships and 691.8 million tons in 2011. For farmers like Aisha, these growing numbers represent expanding opportunities, but also increasing vulnerability to global disruptions. When the Ever Given blocked the canal in 2021, the effects rippled back to small producers. Our cooperative had 4 shipments delayed, she explains. For fresh produce, even a few days can mean total loss. We had to quickly find local buyers for what we could, but at much lower prices. This incident highlighted how Nile water feeds into complex global interdependencies. A single disruption anywhere along this chain, from water access to shipping logistics, can threaten livelihoods thousands of miles from the problem source. Integration into global markets brings additional challenges for Nile Basin farmers. International certification requirements create significant hurdles for small producers. Aisha maintains detailed records of water usage, fertilizer applications, and harvest conditions to satisfy European importers. Her cooperative pooled resources to obtain global GAP certification, without which European markets would remain closed to them. Sometimes it feels like we're farming paperwork as much as peppers, Aisha says, showing a thick binder of compliance documents. But without these certifications, we cannot access the markets that pay premium prices. Climate variability presents perhaps the most serious threat to this delicate balance. For export farmers, water scarcity means potential exclusion from markets that demand consistent quality and volume. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam introduces additional uncertainty. While potentially beneficial for overall water management, the dam will alter river flow patterns that farmers have relied upon. Despite these challenges, the Nile continues to serve as a crucial artery connecting African agricultural production to global markets. This position creates opportunities beyond traditional agriculture. Some farmers specialize in high-value niche products, while others form direct relationships with European retailers. Agricultural processing facilities are emerging along the Nile, allowing producers to export finished products rather than raw commodities. For Aisha, this evolution continues. She recently invested in solar-powered cold storage that extends her produce's shelf life. Her cooperative is exploring digital platforms that connect them directly with specialty retailers in Europe. My children see possibilities I never imagined, Aisha says. My daughter studies agricultural economics and talks about supply chains and value addition. My son is interested in organic certification and premium markets. Like the Nile itself, which begins as distant mountain streams before flowing across continents, Aisha's farm represents how local efforts join larger currents of global commerce. Her children's futures, built on her struggle to balance ancient water rhythms with modern market demands, embody the river's enduring power to connect and transform the lives it touches. A river's future. The next generation along the Nile isn't just reimagining farming, they're reimagining cooperation itself. Across the contested waters of the Nile Basin, a remarkable movement is taking shape as young environmental activists from Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia defy historical animosities to address shared challenges that transcend borders. They're tackling what many of their elders have failed to resolve: how to manage a river that belongs to everyone and no one. At a monitoring station near the Blue Nile Falls, Layla Ibrahim checks water quality readings and uploads the data to a shared platform accessible to partners hundreds of miles downstream. The 26-year-old Ethiopian biologist coordinates with counterparts in Sudan and Egypt as part of the Nile Youth Conservation Network, a grassroots initiative with monitoring posts at 20 strategic points along the river's course. My grandfather told me Egypt was our enemy, Layla says, adjusting equipment that measures sediment levels. but Tariq in Cairo and I video call weekly to compare readings. We're speaking the same language, the language of science and shared concern. The network began 3 years ago when university students from the 3 nations met at a regional climate conference. What started as informal data sharing has evolved into an early warning system for pollution events, harmful algal blooms, and water quality threats that affect communities regardless of national boundaries. In Cairo, Tariq Mahmoud maintains the Egyptian monitoring stations. Politicians talk about water security as if it is a zero-sum game, he explains. But we see it differently. When Ethiopian waters are polluted, that pollution eventually reaches Egypt. When Egyptian coastal communities face saltwater intrusion, it reduces the entire basin's agricultural output. Their approach represents a fundamental shift in how the Nile's waters are conceptualized, as a single interconnected system rather than separate national segments. The network has expanded to include satellite monitoring, community education programs, and joint research tracking everything from microplastic contamination to fish migration patterns disrupted by dam construction. While diplomats debate water allocation percentages behind closed doors, these young conservationists focus on practical, tangible improvements that benefit communities throughout the basin. We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect diplomatic solutions, says Amar Osman, a Sudanese hydrologist who coordinates the network's middle section. Climate change is already altering rainfall patterns across the basin. We're seeing more extreme floods followed by longer droughts. This is everyone's problem. Layla, Tariq, and Amara studied international frameworks to design their cooperative model. They've incorporated elements that address the Nile's unique challenges, its extreme length crossing numerous ecological zones, the historic power imbalances between upstream and downstream nations, and the complex colonial legacy of water treaties. Their work extends beyond monitoring. The network has established community-based conservation initiatives where farmers from different countries share sustainable irrigation techniques. Ethiopian terracing methods are being adopted in northern Sudan, while Egyptian water-saving technologies are finding new applications in Ethiopian highlands. The network recently organized a basin-wide climate adaptation conference that brought together 150 young environmental leaders from all 11 Nile Basin countries. They produced a comprehensive youth declaration on equitable water management that has gained attention from regional policymakers. What makes their approach significant, explains Dr. Joseph Nkurunziza, a water governance expert at the University of Khartoum, is that they're building cooperation from the ground up rather than imposing it from above. They're creating shared identity around the river that transcends national identity. This emerging sense of Nile citizenship could provide a foundation for more formal cooperative frameworks. The Nile Basin Initiative represents an existing platform that brings together riparian countries, but has struggled to overcome fundamental disagreements about water allocation rights. We're demonstrating what cooperation looks like in practice, says Tariq. When we collect data together, when we solve problems together, we build trust. And trust is what's been missing from formal negotiations. Climate change adds urgency to their work, while also creating new imperatives for collaboration. Rising temperatures and increased extreme weather events are exacerbating water scarcity throughout the basin. Yet these shared threats highlight the need for joint solutions. The climate crisis makes cooperation essential, explains Amara. Our monitoring network has already helped communities prepare for floods and manage water resources during droughts. When we share information across borders, everyone benefits. The network's efforts are gaining institutional support. Several international development agencies now provide funding for their monitoring equipment, while universities across the region offer technical expertise. Some government agencies have begun incorporating their data into official planning processes, acknowledging the value this grassroots initiative provides. What began as a student project has evolved into a model that could inform similar efforts in other contested river basins. The approach demonstrates that water cooperation can begin with practical, technical collaboration rather than comprehensive political agreements. The Nile connects us whether we acknowledge it or not, says Layla. Our great-grandparents understood this. Somehow, in the age of nationalism, we forgot. But now climate change is forcing us to remember that rivers don't recognize borders. The network advocates approaches recognizing both historical dependencies and future development needs, where hydropower generation in Ethiopia can coexist with agricultural productivity in Egypt and Sudan if managed collaboratively. Their proposal for a joint development fund would channel percentage of benefits from all major Nile infrastructure projects into basin-wide conservation and adaptation initiatives, shifting from competing over water quantities to cooperating on water quality and watershed health. We're talking about sharing responsibility for a resource that has sustained civilizations for millennia, explains Tariq, and could continue to do so if we manage it wisely. The emergence of this transnational youth conservation movement suggests that conflict over the Nile's waters is not inevitable. It demonstrates that even in regions with deep historical tensions, new generations can forge collaborative approaches to shared challenges. As our journey along the Nile comes to an end, we're reminded that beneath the headlines of water disputes lies a profound truth. This river transcends mere geography. The Nile connects 11 nations through its waters, shared dreams and challenges. The Ethiopian farmer and Egyptian fisherman may never meet, yet their lives intertwine through this ancient waterway. Their stories reveal water as identity, sustenance, spiritual connection, and enduring hope. The Nile teaches us that our differences dissolve when we recognize our common humanity. By seeing the faces behind resource conflicts, we find solutions that honor both human needs and nature's boundaries.